Hello, this is Ryan McCormick, host and executive producer of the Outer Limits of Inner Truth radio show. I want to let you know that we're giving Cosmic Continuum full permission to re-air the interview that we did with Jon Rappoport about how to escape from the matrix of control. I love Cosmic Continuum. I think it's a phenomenal channel, a lot of great videos. I hope you get a chance to watch all of them. And if you get a chance, please check out our show, outerlimitsradio.com. And let's begin today's interview with Jon Rappoport. Our special guest today on the Outer Limits of Inner Truth radio show is Mr. Jon Rappoport. He has worked as a freelance investigative reporter for the last 30 years. He is author of 3 incredible collections, which are The Matrix Revealed, Escape of the Matrix, and Power Outside the Matrix. He's written for every major national publication you can think of. He's produced radio and TV programs. He's been a very forceful advocate for humanity for a very long period of time, and it is truly an honor to have him with us today. Mr. Rappoport, thank you for being with us today.
Sure, it's great to be here. Thank you.
Got it. All right. Can you please explain to our listeners what is the Matrix? People assume the word Matrix and they think it's a movie, sci-fi movie with Keanu Reeves, but what is a Matrix? Is it an actual real structure, and how does it differ from what is perceived in the movie?
Well, let's go back, say, about 20 years, 25 years. I was about 10 years into being a reporter, was writing articles for newspapers and magazines and doing some radio in Los Angeles. And one day it occurred to me that I should widen my scope. The stories I was covering all of a sudden seemed connected to me. Medical fraud, fake epidemics, government corruption, financial chicanery of a high order. I began to see or feel or sense that there was a lot of dot connecting to be done. This was back in the late 80s, early 90s. And I was also at the time writing my first book, which was called AIDS, Inc. Scandal of the Century. And I was getting a first-hand education in what actually goes on in medical research labs where they are supposedly researching to find new viruses and causes of disease and so forth. And this kind of gradual insight took place over the course of, I would say, 2 years, that I was really trying to find an overall structure here. It wasn't just tracking down one story and then another and then another. That there was some connecting tissue that brought all of this together. And yes, elites were certainly involved, and secret societies, there was a history of that, the Rockefeller Empire, and so on and so forth. But what I was really probing for and trying to understand more about was mind control. In other words, the embrace, so to speak, between the human mind and reality. The reality that we see around us, the reality that is propagandized every day in the press, that it was as if a false reality had been built to fit the tendencies of the human mind, like a lock and a key. And if this could be successfully done, then you would have complete mind control. You would have people living their whole lives thinking that they were in the only reality that exists, because pieces of their mind had been infiltrated, so to speak, by a created reality. Now, most people think of the Matrix as the created reality, but I thought and confirmed to myself that it was much deeper than that. It was this lock and key, that the mind is prepared to accept certain kinds of reality that fit the mind's tendencies. And one of those tendencies, for example, is the collective. Propaganda about the collective, the group, all of us, the we, the big we, the unified everything, is very attractive to the mind. And so the mind can be propagandized into believing that some sort of collective or collectivist ideal is going to be achieved if we just cooperate with the right people and go along with the right program, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. And I found this to be complete deception. But yet the mind, at least in part, has a tendency to want to go along with that idea. It's attracted to it like a magnet. And so it tends to accept that kind of what I would call false reality. Right. And when I began to see this lock and key connection, that's when my research into the matrix really started.
John, I'd like to just pause you for 1 second. When you say that there are certain areas of the mind that can be infiltrated, what areas of the mind are vulnerable to this kind of suggestion or this kind of manipulation?
Well, the one that I just described, and I'll give you a couple more.
Is it a certain part of the brain? I mean, are you describing the
No,
mind?
I don't think of it as the brain. In other words, the mind is separate from the brain.
Okay.
The brain is like a kind of computer, if you will, that is the bridge between the mind and the body. It's the operating system, it's the programming, the software that connects the mind and the body. So I would say that you have you and I, which is even beyond the mind, and then you've got the mind, and then you've got the brain, and then you've got the body. It's kind of a bit of a hierarchy of function, if you will. And so when I say that there are parts of the mind that are vulnerable to reality programming, I'm really talking about something separate from the brain. I'm talking about the hopes and the desires and the fears that are there buried in the mind. The desire, for example, for a utopia. The fear of a dystopia or a horrendous future that is coming up for all of humanity. And because these tendencies are there and because they're basically overblown, they're vulnerable to overblown propaganda, promising us that we're all moving in the right direction and that great things just lie over the horizon. There's nothing we need to do about it. The universe is going to speak through us and everything is going to be just fine. Or on the other hand, that we're facing a horrible catastrophe next week or next month or next year and everything is going to be destroyed. These aspects of mind are like sponges waiting to soak up false realities.
Okay, let me ask you this. These tendencies, are these a fundamental quality of human consciousness? And are these qualities, these fundamental character traits, are they also commonalities in other conscious beings from various other areas within our physical dimension? Is this just one fundamental aspect of being human, from what you've observed?
No, I wouldn't say that it's fundamental. I would say that it is a tendency or a propensity that is based on a faulty interpretation of experience.
Okay.
If we're looking at really the basic qualities of mind or consciousness, we're talking about an unlimited potential that expands in all directions, unimpeded. That would be what's really, really there in consciousness. But over time, there are shades and colorations and so forth that are allowed in the door of consciousness that are these kinds of tendencies that I'm talking about.
Okay.
So they're not inherent, they're not built in, it's not fate or destiny that they're always there. But when you survey human beings, you tend to find them there.
Okay. I have a two-part question for you, and that is this. Is if people are not in the matrix, what are the defining qualities of somebody who's embedded in the matrix? What are some of the defining qualities of somebody who's not embedded in the matrix? And also, for people who are involved or embedded in this matrix of control, what perceptions, what areas of perception are they not able to perceive? What are they cut off from?
Okay, that's it's a very wide-ranging and good question.
Thank you.
There's several ways I can answer that. A person who is embedded in the matrix, and people really have to screw their brains and their minds in to understand what I'm trying to say here. They are subject to a kind of program which I call sometimes the existence program, or the what exists program. They look around and they say, well, that exists, and this exists, and that exists, and this exists, and yeah, and they watch television, news, and they say, well, this exists, this story is real, this is real. And underlying all that kind of acceptance, passive acceptance, is a kind of fundamental program about accepting what exists, what already exists, what's said to exist, what's presented as existing. This exists, that exists, this is real, that's real. Instead of the capacity to stand off a bit and say, well, wait a minute. Is this the whole story? Is this factual or is it false? And if it's factual, is there any context here that I can understand more deeply if I understand the context? Is the reality that I'm perceiving every day the only reality? Are we living in the only space and the only time there is? Is this it? And those people who, the overwhelming majority of people who live on Earth, would tend to answer all of those questions with a yes. They would say, well, what else could there be? If this exists, and that exists, and this exists. I'm looking at my table right now, and there's a bottle of vitamins on it, and there's a rock, and a book, and a clock, and a set of earphones, and a mouse, and a notebook, and a pen. That's what exists. This is it. Not only do they exist, but that's all that exists. It's a kind of passive receivership, acceptance of what is. And it goes on and on and on and on in a very kind of passive way. And so people who are embedded in the matrix tend to live and behave and think and perceive in that fashion.
Okay.
Someone who is outside the matrix, really outside the matrix, first of all, has a tremendous ability to analyze what is going on in the matrix at a much deeper level, to see some various programs that are operating in human beings, to see various aspects of mind control and so forth. But beyond that, and this to me is the big one, a person who is outside the matrix recognizes that he has an infinite imagination and infinite creative potential to create realities. And this is entirely missing from people who are embedded in the matrix. Because one of the fundamental, if not the most fundamental, program operating in the matrix is that imagination is useless. It's just a toy for children. When you grow up, you throw it away. The overwhelming number of humans have no creative potential at all. There's just a few very talented people, and that's it. And creative, what does creative even mean? What does imagination even mean? Is there really anything that exists like that? Probably not. There's no reason to pay any attention to that, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So a person who is outside the matrix has tremendous and powerful creative potential to create reality. And to analyze what that means, among other things, is that the person can invent futures for himself and other people if they want to voluntarily join in, can be an artist of reality, so to speak, can be extraordinarily inventive and innovative, can see solutions to problems that other people don't see, and can act on them decisively and with great effect. And the spectrum, if you will, of creative potential ultimately has no limit. That is to say, everything that people now think of as being, quote, paranormal, the capacity to produce paranormal effects, those are creative effects. And a person who is outside the matrix can access that in himself and develop those abilities to unlimited capacity. So those would be the fundamental differences, I would say, between embedded in the matrix and outside the matrix.
Well, and Jon, I want to let our listeners know real quick, because we didn't promote this at the beginning of the show, but to learn more about Jon, you want to go to his website, nomorefakenews.com. And in addition to seeing his blog updated on a regular basis, most of his articles are frequently shared in alternative media. And you can go to this really interesting page he has where he's got 4 different products that'll really help you shake out of this. And I love this one that you have. It's called Power Outside the Matrix, and you were kind of going into a little bit. What are some of the 3 or 4 different things that a person can do right now to liberate themselves from the matrix? What are some of the things that they can do to kind of tap into that incredible infinite talent pool that you were just talking about?
Well, the first thing I would say is find an old book on logic and study the hell out of it. Find a book that used to be taught in schools and isn't taught anymore, a step-by-step, very specific course in logic, and study it and study it and study it and study it until you understand it backwards and forwards. Because one can apply those principles and that sharpness of mind to analyze the flood of information that we are subjected to every day here. And by doing that, step by step, one tends to get out of the matrix and to see it from the outside as to all the fallacious kinds of reasoning and thought processes that go into the creation of false realities, informational realities that people are subjected to. So that's one thing. Okay. Now, of course, in my collection, Exit from the Matrix, I have a very long audio section called Analyzing Information in the Age of Disinformation, which takes up not only certain ideas in logic, but goes beyond that in a very contemporary way to say, how do you investigate? How do you probe and analyze and carry out a real investigation of a major issue to determine the truth, the falsity, what's really going on there from all sides? So that's one thing. The other thing, and I would say that this is a kind of experiment that people can do. Open a file, a Word document or whatever kind of documents you use, into 2 sections. And in one section is the heading, what I might desire to do in my life. The other heading is what I would never want to do in my life. And every day you write for as long as you want to in the first section and in the second section. You can make lists, you can write paragraphs, you can write pages, you can write essays. You just answer that question or those 2 questions, and you shift back and forth. What I might like to do in my life, what I would never want to do in my life, et cetera, et cetera. And you go back and forth and back and forth. And the key there is, and I've seen this work with many of my private clients and with people who I suggest this to, that second list, what I would never want to do in my life, will eventually tend to produce some really dynamic, explosive insights. Because where does a person stash all of the things that they either absolutely don't want to do or wouldn't want to do or think are impossible for them to do, even though they might want to do it? Well, they stash those things in part of their imagination. They consider them to be imaginary. So when you start to access things you would never want to do in your life, you are beginning to invent, you're beginning to imagine, you're beginning to create. And I've had people, and this has happened to me as well, you're writing down something, I would never want to do this, and and you can make up the most outlandish things, and all of a sudden, something pops up, an idea that stops you dead in your tracks, and you say, well, wait a minute. Maybe I would actually want to do that. Why am I putting it in this list? And you begin to think about it, and the more you think about it, the more you begin to connect with some deep buried desire that you've had for a long time to do that or to do something like that. At that point, you stop everything and you begin writing about that. And you write and write and write and write and think and think and write and write. And that may be the very thing that propels you back into your inherent state of enormous creative potential to create that thing that you truly want to do.
Okay, so you can have
your life changes.
So you can have a list of maybe a whole list of horrific things, saying, I would never want to do this and that, and some of these things are going to be horrific and maybe disgusting and maybe even repulsive. But then you're saying that maybe by doing that, you're generating or stimulating your creative aspect of your mind, and maybe you're going to pull out some very positive things out there.
Yeah. And it's not only just discussing things that you would never want to do. Somebody would say, well, I would never want to go in a spaceship to Jupiter. Writes that down, and all of a sudden stops dead. Wait a minute. Of course I'd want to go to a spaceship on Jupiter, but it's impossible. And other thoughts begin to pop up like popcorn. This is space, rockets, this, that, boom, boom, boom. And then another idea comes into view, and another idea, like a Tinker Toy set, of things connected in the mind. And all of a sudden an idea that the person didn't write down pops up, and, the next thing he knows, he realizes something connected to all of that is extremely profound for him, that he's been burying for the last 20 or 30 years. And in comes a rush of positive energy and a sense of being able to create and imagine and invent, and he's off and running on a whole new life.
Okay. You've got one of your products is called Exit from the Matrix, and you have some techniques that you use to shatter or break out of the Matrix. You talk about paranormal experiments and exercises. What are some of these paranormal experiments and exercises that you would recommend that would help you break out of this?
Well, there are whole sections of these exercises. Okay. There are about, I would estimate, 70 or 80 exercises there. And the point of it is that you study this material. I mean, this is for real. This isn't like, oh, that was an interesting video, or, oh, I kind of enjoyed that audio, and, blah, blah. No, this is like you're going for a PhD, but not because some teacher's there or the college or the university. It's because you're intensely interested. So you study this material, you listen to it a number of times, you take notes, and you write down these exercises. And then every day you look over these exercises, which I describe very clearly. They're all imagination exercises. And you choose a couple that you feel like you want to do on that particular day, and you do them. You are now exercising in a very profound and significant way your own imagination, in a way that you've never done it before. And in doing that, you awaken all parts of consciousness that have been asleep, that have been dozing and napping and snoozing inside the matrix, and now you begin to feel like you are in a new position vis-a-vis the matrix. You're not any longer embedded in it. You're getting out of it. You're feeling that creative potential within yourself, and you're feeling the power to be able to invent reality, invent future. That's the point of all of this.
Okay.
That's what takes a person out.
It pulls them out. And now, does that allow a person to see beyond these? That this is one reality that we're in. That beyond. Do you see multi-dimensional perception when they start to do that?
Well, some people indeed experience that, but even beyond that is the notion that you can create multi-realities. It's not just seeing them, It's not just knowing that they exist. It's being able to invent them.
Okay.
And I'll give you a kind of a metaphor for this. Think of the painter before the blank canvas. The feeling of the painter as he stands before the blank canvas. He knows that he's about to embark into a different space, the space of the canvas, and everything that implies. This is not the space of his room. This is not the space of the studio. This is not the space of the window or what's beyond the window in his studio. This is not the space of him sleeping or eating at the breakfast table or any of that. This is a completely different space that is waiting, so to speak, for him to create upon it. When he paints, he invents another space. He invents another reality. So if you look at that metaphor and see it, what I'm talking about here is the creative potential, the capacity within each one of us to create multi-realities here, instead of just paying allegiance to this reality that we see and experience and accept around us. So yeah, it goes beyond even being able to perceive multi-realities. And that's the point. That's where, in fact, most people who write about what I'm talking about stop short. They're saying essentially to people, how would you like to be able to perceive realities beyond this one? Well, sure, great, fantastic, okay, fine. But why stop there? That isn't the end of things. You could say, well, I had an extremely vivid dream last night while I was asleep, and I was there. I was really there. I experienced a different reality. Great, fantastic. But is that the end of it? Absolutely not. You can take it further, much further than that. You can create your own realities.
Okay.
That's going way beyond that. That's way beyond Matrix.
Jon, when did the Matrix really kind of pick up, and who's behind the Matrix? And also, at the same time, what's the purpose of it? Is this a punishment for humanity? Is this a punishment for us to come here to live on Earth and be controlled for something that we've done in previous lifetimes? Or is this an evolutionary test for us?
I would say that the idea of this being a punishment is part of the program that many people accept. That's why one of the reasons that they're embedded so deep in the Matrix, because they think they deserve to be. That's part of Earth programming 101, to say, okay, well, the reason that you're here, you see, is that you're a bad boy, you're a bad girl, and this is your comeuppance. So don't mess around and try to pretend otherwise. Now, if you buy that product, at the store, the spiritual store, then as long as you keep buying it and keep, going over it and accepting it, you're sunk, you're done, you're toast. Because that will just keep you totally embedded in the Matrix.
Okay, when you say embedded in the Matrix, is that from this lifetime, or can you be stuck in the Matrix for multiple lifetimes?
People can be stuck in Matrix for, hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of lifetimes. Just come back to do it all again. I'm going to do it again. I'm going to do it again. I'm going to try to do a little better. But better is not enough. Different is what you want. Different is what you want. If you go back to the early Tibetans and their practice, which was remarkably unique and different from any other spiritual system on the planet before then and now. They were talking essentially about, if we use the Matrix terminology, you can be completely outside of it, and you can operate in it, but you are not it. You are not embedded. You are different from it, and you know it, absolutely know it. So yes, the answer to your question is sure. People keep coming back, accept the basic programming each time, you know, and then they say, well, okay, given all of this programming that I'm operating on, I'm going to try to do a little better now. Well, you know, okay, fine, if that's what people want to do, but it really doesn't work. It's not a good solution to the situation. What you really want to do is to understand, in the way that we've been talking for the last half hour or so, about what Matrix is and getting out of it and having power outside it, which means being able to operate in it, operate outside of it, and not be completely magnetized back into it to the point where you lose your consciousness. That's really what you're aiming for.
You observe what is occurring in the Matrix from your perspective. Do you feel that the Matrix is dying in some capacity? Because I think people who are awake and are aware right now, they see that the fear-mongering seems to be at an all-time high. You have a lot of governments, a lot of people in a perpetual state of fear, worried about the economy, worried about, you know, global war. And it's a perpetual state of fear that I've never experienced in my lifetime before. And I was wondering what the purpose of that is, and where do you see the trajectory of this going? Is this part of the programming? Is the Matrix actually going to, are we actually going to live in a world without this Matrix over us?
I think ultimately the answer to that is yes. We will be living in a world without the Matrix, but when I say, I'm talking long term here, very long term. I have, you know, I could make estimates in terms of hundreds of years, but the thing is, we came to the beginning of the 20th century. There was a moment in time when people began to feel the sense of liberation. End of the 19th, beginning of the 20th. It actually went back somewhat further than that, but people began to see, okay, look, the human race has been inventing these superstitions and realities for a very long time, and then pretending that they came from somewhere else, and then becoming afraid of them, and then bowing down to them, and then running away from them, and doing all kinds of crazy things. But we now are beginning to sense and understand that we were the inventors, ultimately, that we cooked all of this up, that we did this to ourselves more than even what is being done to us. It's not one or the other, but the awareness was growing. Gee, you know, if you cook up your own demons and then you pretend that they were there all the time, and then you start feeling fear, and then you're vulnerable to propaganda about fear. I mean, all of this is just some horrendous vortex. Who would want to really experience that? People began to sense that there was a way out of all of this, and that it had to do with understanding their own imagination, their own creative potential. Because, you know, people can also create negative things that diminish them, that make them more fearful, that make them more vulnerable. Yeah, we're beginning to see this. And then a new era of fundamentalism began to creep in at the edges. People began to be afraid of that dawning realization that they were having, and so they began to retreat. Where do you retreat when you retreat? You go back to basic limbic reactions, fear, hatred, resentment, opposition, conflict. You retreat back into your group, you know, your collective, your tribe, your clan. because you feel that that's the only safe place to be. So there was then a reversal, and that reversal has been continuing. But more and more people are waking up, and more people are beginning to understand their own role in this incredibly strange stage play called Matrix. They're beginning to see their own part in this, and they're beginning to see that it does them no good to deny their own role, and that in order to solve this whole problem, they don't have to go off on some crazy tangent and invent yet one more gigantic external force that's going to save them from everything and descend out of the clouds and do all of this rescue operation, et cetera, et cetera. They're realizing that that would just be another turn of the same wheel. They would be doing the same crazy thing over and over again, that they can not do that and instead begin to tap into their own creative power and see where they can really take this, how far, how wide, how deep, how high, instead of using that creative power to diminish their own consciousness and their own freedom. Okay. And that, I believe, I know, has been reborn on planet Earth. It's going to take a long time for it to sink in with enough people so that something definitive happens to our civilization, so to speak, or to life on planet Earth, because it's going to take a number of people who are really with that to make a visible difference.
Sure.
But there is time. What's inside a human being, the greatest potential and imagination and creativity and so forth, that power is never going to go away. It never dies. It can never be completely defeated. It can never be buried. It always wants to come back out because it's inherently part of what I am, what you are, what every individual is. And that's why it's taken so much constant mind control on and on and on through the centuries to press and press down on the human race and keep them in a state of half-light, sleep, hypnotic trance, because the power that's within each individual is so majestic and huge. So it will emerge. There's nothing that can stop it. But how long that's going to take depends upon each individual's willingness to wake up to it.
Yeah, I give you a lot of credit, John. I mean, I've read your articles, and you really do have a lot of faith in the individual. You really do a lot of faith in people. If you were to make I hate to use the word prediction, but if you were to give an outlook, do you think that the world's going to be in a state of dystopia, of tyranny, akin to the movie 1984? Do you think we're going to see some economic apocalypse or some kind of dark era of humanity before humanity can truly wake up enough people to, I don't know, have this beautiful era where we're exploring our full potential and appreciating the individual?
I can answer that best by saying I think that we're going to go through a period next where what I call, and I wrote an article about this, I don't know, a couple of weeks ago, the stimulus response empire, where that's going to get worse. The programmers and the elites on this planet have decided that we are nothing more than biological machines who are, in fact, dangerous because we've been misprogrammed since the beginning, and we're just kind of like Wild West cowboys and animals running around, and we have to have better programming. And that's what they've been after and doing in one way or another for a very long time now. And so I believe that we're going to go through a period of more of that, increased the idea of reprogramming the human race. But eventually that is going to die. There is going to be a massive revolt against that because it's going to get worse, because people are going to feel it more than they feel it now. And they're going to realize that this thing called power, their own potential, their own creative power, their own imagination, is really being squeezed and squeezed harder and harder and harder. And they don't want to take it, and they won't take it. and they're going to break out of it, and it won't be pretty for a while. It may be a long while, but eventually people are going to get their legs back, so to speak, under them and realize that their job is to live to their true potential, to act on all of this, and that postponing it any further under whatever excuse they want to give is no longer a good play. It's no longer a good move. And we're going to see something quite different in terms of what the world looks like than it does now.
Mr. Jon Rappoport, it was truly an honor to have you on our program today. There's so many more questions we wanted to ask you, but we know that you are very busy, and we want to let people know that they can go to your website at nomorefakenews.com. You're going to see regular updates on there. You go to his section, you'll have 3 or 4 different great programs that will help you escape from the matrix. Jon is regularly featured on the national alternative media. You got to keep an eye on him. He's got a lot of great articles. Mr. Rappoport, thank you so much for being with us today.
And thank you. I really appreciate it.